Welcome back to the show, everyone. Last time, we really went deep on Tkinter tree view,
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
from displaying MySQL records to inserting them, deleting them.
Even implementing pagination.
Hopefully you had some time to experiment with that. But if not, don't worry. We've got the link to that previous episode in the description below.
Definitely check it out if you're just joining us.
Today, we're focusing on something pretty specific, displaying MySQL records in a Tkinter window.
Yeah, we've got some really cool source material for this.
And it walks through a bunch of different approaches, which is kind of interesting.
You know what I think is cool about that? It shows that, like, in programming, there's not always just one right way to do things. Some of these approaches are all about simplicity,
Right.
but others are more focused on things like security and how easy it is to maintain the code later on.
I see what you mean. So let's jump in with what our sources call the direct database connection method. This one seems to be about getting up and running fast.
Yeah.
So how's it work?
Well, the code uses this library called MySQL.connector, and it makes connecting to a MySQL database pretty straightforward. You just give it your credentials, host, username, password, stuff like that, and the database name, and you're basically connected. It's like a direct line to your data, I guess you could say.
Okay, and then I see it executes a SQL query to grab data from a table called student.
Right.
And look, our old friend, the limit clause, is back. It's only grabbing 10 records at a time? So is that like a mini version of pagination?
Yeah, you could think of it that way. It's basically managing how much data gets pulled in at once, which is important when you're working with visual interfaces. Like, you don't want to overload the user with like a million rows of data all at once, right?
Right.
But there's a trade-off here. Storing those database credentials directly in your code, well, that can be a bit of a security risk. Anyone who can see your code, well, they could see those credentials too.
Oh, yeah, good point.
So you got to think about that. Convenience versus security.
Yeah, definitely something to keep in mind. So what are some ways to make it more secure?
Well, instead of putting the credentials directly in the code, you could use what are called environment variables, or maybe even a separate configuration file. Those ways you're keeping that sensitive info kind of tucked away, separate from the main part of your code. Makes it harder for someone to sneak a peek.
Okay, that makes sense. Like putting an extra lock on the door, right?
Exactly. So let's say we've got our data all nice and secure. How do we actually get it to show up in our Tkinter window?
Yeah, how do we make that happen?
So this example uses what are called Tkinter entry widgets. Basically, each little piece of data gets its own little box. It's almost like making a little mini spreadsheet inside your Tkinter application.
Okay, I can see that. But I bet arranging all those little boxes takes some careful coding.
Oh, for sure. It uses what's called a nested loop structure. Basically, it goes through each row of data, and then for each row, it goes through each column. That way, every piece of data ends up in the right spot, making a nice organized grid. Kind of like if you were laying out tiles on a floor or something.
Gotcha. So that covers the direct connection method using MySQL.connector. But I know our source material also mentions using SQL Alchemy as another way to do this.
Yeah.
What's the benefit of going that route?
Skill alchemy is something called an object relational mapper, or ORM for short. Basically, it acts like a translator between your Python code and your database.
Okay.
Instead of writing out raw SQL queries, you work with these Python objects that represent your data. It can make things feel a lot more natural, like you're not switching back and forth between two completely different ways of thinking.
That reminds me of those ORMs I've used in other languages.
Exactly. And one of the really nice things about Skill Alchemy is how it handles database connections. If you look at the code, you'll see that the whole connection setup is just one line.
Wow, that's a lot cleaner than the multi-line approach we saw with MySQL connector.
It is. Plus, you can still use SQL when you need to. Like if you need to do a really complex query or something, you can still write it out in SQL.
So you get the best of both worlds. The ease of working with Python objects, but also the power and flexibility of SQL when you need it.
Yeah.
So how do you decide when to use a direct connection versus SQL Alchemy?
Well, one big factor is the size of your project. For smaller projects where you just want to keep things simple, a direct connection might be fine.
Yeah.
But as your project gets bigger, Skill Alchemy can really help you keep your code organized and easier to maintain. And ORMs like Skill Alchemy often have built-in security features that protect against things like SQL injection attacks, which is always a good thing.
Makes sense. So it's like choosing the right tool for the job. Sometimes you need a hammer, sometimes you need a screwdriver.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between simplicity, security, and scalability. Okay, so now we've got the data flowing into our Tinter window. But I have a feeling it's not exactly a visual masterpiece yet, right?
Yeah, probably not winning any design awards.
Right. So our sources talk about some ways to spruce things up a bit. And one of the first things they suggest is swapping those entry widgets for label widgets.
Oh, okay. What's the advantage there?
Mm.
I mean, they both just displayed text, right?
They do, but label widgets give you more control over how things look. You can customize the borders, the alignment, the background color, the fonts. You can really make the information pop and make it easier for the user to read.
Okay, I can see how that visual polish can make a big difference.
It's like the difference between a plain text document and a nicely formatted report, you know?
But even with a fancy layout, wouldn't it be confusing without, some way to tell what each column represents? Like column headers or something?
Absolutely. You need those labels to tell people what they're looking at. Imagine a spreadsheet without column names, right? It would be a nightmare.
Yeah, total chaos.
So the code shows this really neat trick using, you guessed it, label widgets again.
Label widgets for everything.
Pretty much. But it uses them to create a separate row at the top for the headers. And you can even style them differently so they stand out from the data rows. It's a small thing, but it makes a huge difference in terms of usability.
So it's not just about dumping data onto the screen. It's about presenting it in a way that makes sense to the user.
Exactly. And I noticed a little detail in the code. When you add that header row, you have to adjust how you number the data rows. It's a small thing, but it can trip you up if you're not paying attention.
Oh yeah, those little details can be tricky.
They can. But that's why it's so valuable to learn from examples like this. You see all those little nuances that you might not think about otherwise. Okay, so we've talked about direct connections, squalogamy, entry widgets, label widgets, column headers. Quite the toolkit for displaying MySQL data in Tkinter.
We've covered a lot of ground. Now I'm kind of curious about something. The source material mentions that this code can also work with SQLite.
Right.
Now, I know both of those are relational databases, but what's the difference in practice? Like, when would you choose one over the other?
The main difference is in how you set up the connection. The connection string for SQLite looks different from the one for MySQL, but beyond that, it often comes down to the size and purpose of your application. SQLite is lightweight, and it's file-based. So it's great for smaller projects or if you don't need all the bells and whistles of a big server-based database like MySQL.
So it's like choosing between a scooter and a truck.
Exactly. If you're building like a personal task manager or a small data analysis tool, SQLite might be perfect. But if you're working with huge data sets, multiple users, or complex transactions, then you'll probably want the power and features of MySQL.
So it really depends on what you're building.
Mm-hmm.
This raises an interesting question for our listeners, actually.
Right.
What factors would you consider when choosing a database for your Tkinter project? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, before we move on, I just want to make sure we're not losing sight of the big picture here. What's the end goal of all this? Why are we going through all this effort to display MySQL data in a Tkinter window?
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the technical details, but the ultimate goal is to create something that's easy for people to use, like an interface that makes it easy to view data, whether it's student records or inventory or whatever.
So it's about bridging the gap between raw data and human understanding.
Yeah, exactly. It's about empowering people to actually make sense of the information and use it to make decisions.
I love that. It's not just about the code. It's about what the code can do for people.
Right. It's about design thinking in software development, thinking about how people will actually use the things we build. Okay, maybe we're getting a little too philosophical here.
You're right. Let's bring it back down to earth.
Back to the practicalities.
So we've covered a ton of stuff, but I feel like there's still so much more to explore.
There is. This is just the foundation. We can use all this to build even more sophisticated Tkinter applications that do really amazing things with MySQL data.
Speaking of which, in our next deep dive, we're going to be looking at how to display MySQL records based on user-entered IDs.
Yeah, basically adding a search function to our Tkinter apps.
I can't wait for that. But for now, I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about. We've looked at direct database connections, squalogamy, entry widgets, label widgets, even column headers.
And database choices. And user-centric design.
It's been a whirlwind tour.
It has. But remember, this is just the beginning. There's a whole universe out there of Tkinter and MySQL.
Absolutely. So keep experimenting, keep learning, and keep that creative spark alive.
We'll be back soon with more deep dives. But before you go,
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our future adventures in code.
And if you have a minute, we'd love to hear what you think. Leave a review and let us know what you want to explore with us in future episodes.
Your feedback really helps us make the show better.
All right, that's it for today's deep dive. Happy coding, everyone. And hey, if you liked what you heard today, make sure to hit that subscribe button.
Yeah, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. We've got a lot more cool stuff planned.
Definitely. And speaking of cool stuff, we always love to hear your feedback.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Leave us a review and let us know what you'd like to see in future episodes.
What topics are you curious about? What challenges are you facing in your own projects? Let us know. Your feedback really helps us shape the show and make sure we're delivering the content you're looking for.
It really does. All right, so that's it for today's deep dive into displaying MySQL data in Tkinter. Hopefully you've learned a few new tricks and are feeling inspired to go out there and build something awesome.
Until next time, keep experimenting, keep learning, and most importantly, keep having fun with code.
Happy coding, everyone!